500 years ago, a realm existed that could have changed the very map of Europe as we know it today. A realm of gold-threaded banners, glittering courts, and vaults overflowing with the wealth of half a continent. This was no ordinary kingdom. It was the creation of dukes who thought like emperors, merchants who traded like kings, and artists whose work would outlast dynasties. Yet strangely, almost no one today remembers its name. We think of France and the Holy Roman Empire as the great players of medieval Europe, but between them, literally between them, there once rose a third contender. Its cities pulsed with trade, its armies gleamed in polished steel, and its rulers dreamed of wearing a crown that could rival any in Christendom. For nearly a century, it stood poised to tilt the balance of power. Then, in a sudden storm of war and political intrigue, it vanished from the map. This was the Burgundian State, part duchy, part empire in the making, a political chimera stretching from the vineyards of Dijon to the bustling ports of the North Sea. It was a place where the clash of knights on the tournament field was as calculated as any diplomatic maneuver, where the merchants of Bruges and Ghent could finance wars or topple rulers, and where the court's extravagance set the standard for all of Europe. Its rulers, the Valois dukes of Burgundy, were not content to be mere vassals to the French king. They married strategically, conquered decisively, and governed shrewdly. They built something unprecedented, a realm that united French-speaking nobles, Dutch-speaking merchants, and German-speaking towns under a single banner. It was not just rich, it was richer than most kingdoms of its time. Some of the most famous works of medieval art were painted for Burgundian patrons. Some of the most important political alliances of the 15th century were negotiated in their gilded halls. And yet, despite all this brilliance, Burgundy fell. Not because of poverty, nor because of plague, but because of ambition, an ambition so great it overreached itself. The last of the great dukes, Charles the Bold, dreamed of forging an independent kingdom, but in his relentless quest for glory he made fatal enemies. The French crown, the Swiss Confederacy, and a tide of political resistance that his armies could not stem. His sudden death left his only heir, Mary of Burgundy, to fight for survival, and her desperate marriage to Maximilian of Habsburg would forever reshape Europe's political destiny. The echoes of that fall are still with us. Modern Belgium and the Netherlands, the centuries-long rivalry between France and the Habsburgs, and even the very idea of a united Europe owe something to the rise and fall of Burgundy. Today, we'll uncover the forgotten empire that might have stood beside France and England as one of history's defining powers, and ask the question, what if Burgundy had never fallen? Welcome to our channel, Words of Time, and in this video we'll explore the grand illusion of Burgundy's hidden power, its glittering rise, its sudden collapse, and the legacy it left etched across Europe's map. Europe's history is often told as a story of two great powers, France in the west, Germany, or the lands of the Holy Roman Empire, in the center, vying for dominance over centuries, shaping the continent's fate. Yet, hidden in the folds of this narrative, there once existed a third contender, a state whose ambition, wealth, and sophistication rivaled or even surpassed its better-remembered neighbors. It was a realm not quite like the kingdoms surrounding it, a hybrid of feudal traditions and modern administrative impulses, a territory woven together by marriage alliances, shrewd diplomacy, and ruthless opportunism. This was the Burgundian State, often called an empire in all but name, a political creation of dukes who dreamed of carving a middle kingdom between France and the German Empire, one that could have become the dominant power of Europe. And yet, for all its ambition and influence in the 15th century, the memory of Burgundy has faded so much that even many educated Europeans today think of Burgundy as just a French wine region rather than the seat of an almost imperial power. To understand the Burgundian dream, one must first appreciate its origins. The name Burgundy itself referred originally to a duchy in eastern France, a relatively small but prestigious fief in the French crown's orbit. This duchy was granted to Philip the Bold, youngest son of King John II of France, in the late 14th century. From this foundation, a series of astute dynastic marriages expanded the territory into a vast and wealthy domain that straddled what is today northeastern France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and large parts of the Netherlands. In an age when political boundaries were fluid, Burgundy's rulers mastered the art of collecting lands not through costly wars, but through inheritance and marital strategy. Each ducal marriage brought in new counties, duchies, and lordships, slowly constructing a realm whose economic and cultural centers lay far from the original duchy. The Dukes of Burgundy soon controlled the wealthy Low Countries, Home to cities like Bruges, Ghent, and Antwerp, urban powerhouses of trade, finance, and luxury production. In a Europe where France and the Holy Roman Empire often found themselves in fractious competition, Burgundy occupied a geographic sweet spot. It lay directly between the two, connecting the Mediterranean to the North Sea and serving as a cultural and economic bridge. Its rulers, especially Philip the Good and Charles the Bold, envisioned this not as a liability but as a strategic advantage. They imagined a realm that could unite these territories into a single, coherent kingdom, effectively reviving the ancient Middle Kingdom of Lotharingia that had briefly existed after the division of Charlemagne's empire. This would have been no mere buffer state, but a rival capable of dictating the balance of power in Western Europe. Burgundy's wealth was staggering for its time. The textile industry of Flanders and Brabant produced fine cloths coveted across the continent. Antwerp's port linked to English wool, Baltic grain, and Mediterranean luxuries. The ducal court, especially under Philip the Good, became famous for its extravagant pageantry, patronage of the arts, and sponsorship of chivalric orders like the Order of the Golden Fleece. Burgundian court culture influenced tastes and politics far beyond its borders, blending French refinement with Flemish artistic brilliance. Painters such as Jan van Eyck found patrons there, and diplomatic gatherings at the Burgundian court were as much theater as politics. Yet, the Burgundian state was also fragile in ways that France and the empire were not. It was not a unified kingdom with a single legal system, but a patchwork of semi-independent principalities bound together by the personal authority of the duke. Each region had its own traditions, laws, and privileges. While this mosaic allowed the duke's flexibility in ruling, it also meant that loyalty was often local rather than to the Burgundian project as a whole. This fragility would become painfully apparent in the reign of Charles the Bold, the most ambitious of all the Burgundian dukes. Charles the Bold inherited the dream of consolidating Burgundy into a kingdom recognized by the major European powers. He sought not just wealth and influence, but formal sovereignty independent of France and the Holy Roman Emperor. His campaigns aimed to connect his northern and southern territories by conquering or acquiring the lands in between, particularly the strategically vital region of Lorraine. But Charles's ambitions ran ahead of his resources. His aggressive policies provoked hostility from both France and the Swiss Confederacy, as well as wary suspicion from the emperor. Despite his military skill, Charles overestimated his ability to face multiple enemies at once. The turning point came in the later part of his reign, when his forces suffered catastrophic defeats against the Swiss, culminating in his death at the Battle of Nancy in 1477. With no male heir, his vast territories became the prize in a scramble between France and the Habsburgs. Through marriage, most of Burgundy's lands passed into the hands of the Habsburg dynasty, laying the groundwork for centuries of Franco-Habsburg rivalry. The original Duchy of Burgundy itself was seized by France, symbolically extinguishing the independent power of the Burgundian dukes. Here lies one of the great historical what-ifs of Europe. What if Charles the Bold had succeeded in uniting his territories into a single recognized kingdom? What if Burgundy had survived as a major power in its own right, positioned between France and the empire? Such a realm might have checked French expansion to the north and east, altered the course of the Italian wars, and perhaps even delayed or changed the Habsburg rise to preeminence. Economically, a strong, centralized Burgundy could have become the leading financial and trade power of early modern Europe, dominating Atlantic and North Sea commerce well before England or the Dutch Republic. Politically, it could have acted as a stabilizing or destabilizing force in continental affairs, playing France and the empire against each other while building its own overseas ventures. Culturally, a surviving Burgundian state might have fused French chivalric traditions with Flemish mercantile dynamism, creating a hybrid model of governance and identity unique in Europe. Its court culture, already influential in the 15th century, could have set artistic and political trends for centuries. The Protestant Reformation might have unfolded differently under Burgundian rule in the Low Countries, perhaps containing religious fragmentation through compromise, or conversely, suppressing it with centralized power. Even the rise of nation-states might have taken a different path if Burgundy had provided a successful model of a multi-ethnic, economically integrated polity. The fact that few remember Burgundy as anything more than a wine region today is partly due to its abrupt collapse. Unlike France or England, which evolved through centuries of continuity, Burgundy's political structure was tied to a single dynasty and vanished when that dynasty failed. Its legacy was absorbed into other powers. France took its heartland, the Habsburgs took its richest northern territories, and so the memory of a distinct Burgundian state faded. Historians, too, often frame their narratives around national histories, making Burgundy appear as a footnote in the stories of its larger neighbors. Only in the specialized study of late medieval politics does the Burgundian state receive the attention it once commanded in the courts of Europe. In some ways, this forgetting is itself a testament to the volatility of power in pre-modern Europe. Even the most dazzlingly wealthy and cultured courts could vanish within a generation, leaving only faint echoes in art, architecture, and historical documents. But the Burgundian dream remains one of the most intriguing paths not taken in European history, a reminder that the familiar map of modern Europe was far from inevitable, and that a third great power once stood ready to reshape the continent between the blue fleur-de-lis of France and the black double-headed eagle of the empire. When Philip the Bold inherited the Duchy of Burgundy in the year 1363, he was not yet a ruler of a mighty realm, but a younger son of the French king granted a prestigious, yet relatively modest appanage. At that moment, Burgundy was still very much a vassal state within the French feudal system, bound by oaths of homage to the crown. Yet Philip was no ordinary prince. He possessed both the patience to play the long game and the political acuity to see that in a Europe governed as much by marriage alliances as by swords, dynastic unions could be sharper than any blade. His marriage to Margaret III of Flanders in the year 1369 was the single most transformative event in the birth of the Burgundian state. Margaret brought with her the counties of Flanders, Artois, Rethel, and the Free County of Burgundy, along with claims in the Low Countries. These were not mere feudal tracts of land. They were among the richest and most urbanized regions in Europe, humming with trade and industry, their cities studded with merchant guild halls and brimming with wool merchants, cloth makers, and bankers. The genius of the Valois dukes lay in recognizing that their newly expanded dominions were not just to be ruled as a patchwork of fiefs, but as a coherent sphere of influence. The Duchy of Burgundy itself was still tied to France, but the Free County and the Low Country territories were part of the Holy Roman Empire, giving the dukes a foot in both the French and imperial worlds. This unusual position allowed them to maneuver diplomatically between two great powers, playing one off the other, offering loyalty when it suited their purpose and neutrality when it was more profitable. Philip's successors understood this delicate balance and refined it into a strategy. John the Fearless, his son, ruled with a more confrontational style, embroiling Burgundy in the Armagnac, Burgundian civil conflict within France during the early 15th century. His involvement in the assassination of Louis of Orleans in 1407 shocked Christendom, but it also underscored the raw political calculation of the Burgundian dukes. They were willing to take extraordinary risks to maintain influence. The result was a temporary ascendancy in French politics, though it came at the cost of bitter enmity. It was under Philip the Good, however, that the Burgundian vision began to crystallize into something approaching empire. Philip, ruling from 1419 to 1467, was both a consummate diplomat and a master of self-presentation. His court at Bruges and later in Brussels became a dazzling display of wealth and cultural refinement, deliberately rivaling and often surpassing the courts of France and England. Under his patronage, the Order of the Golden Fleece was founded in 1430, a chivalric order whose rituals, symbolism, and exclusivity were designed to reinforce the prestige of Burgundian rule. The order drew in the greatest nobles of his territories and allies from across Europe, creating a network of loyalty that transcended feudal obligations. The Burgundian Renaissance under Philip was not just about glittering pageantry. He understood the value of fostering the arts as a means of both glorifying his rule and binding his diverse territories together. The painters Jan van Eyck and Rogier van der Weyden, among others, were commissioned to produce works of unmatched realism and richness, their oils immortalizing the faces of nobles and the majesty of court ceremonies. Musicians like Gilles Binchois and later Guillaume Dufay created polyphonic compositions that traveled across Europe, making the Burgundian court not merely a political center, but also a cultural trendsetter. In tournaments, banquets, and elaborate theatrical pageants, the ideals of chivalry were not only celebrated, but actively shaped to serve Burgundian political aims. Behind the splendor, there was cold, deliberate statecraft. The Burgundian dukes saw that their strength rested not only on noble loyalty, but on economic muscle. The Low Countries were among the wealthiest regions in late medieval Europe, their cities thriving on the cloth trade. English wool was imported to Flanders, where master weavers turned it into luxury fabrics coveted from Iberia to the Baltic. Antwerp emerged as a major hub for international trade, its merchants dealing in spices from the east, silver from Central Europe, and grain from the Baltic. Control over these commercial arteries was like holding the lifeblood of European wealth. The dukes invested in maintaining order on the roads and rivers, reducing tolls in some cases to encourage commerce, and using their naval power to protect maritime routes. One could think of the Burgundian state in economic terms as a late medieval equivalent of a 21st century tech hub. It was not merely rich because of resources, but because it sat at the intersection of innovation, finance, and logistics. Just as modern Silicon Valley thrives on the synergy between technology firms, venture capital, and a culture of innovation, the Burgundian Low Countries thrived on the interplay between merchants, artisans, and financial networks. Bruges in particular was home to Lombard bankers, Hanseatic merchants, and English wool factors, creating a cosmopolitan environment where money and ideas flowed freely. The dukes benefited not just from taxes, but from their role as guarantors of stability in a volatile region, making their lands attractive to investors and traders alike. The military aspect of Burgundian power was no less significant. While the dukes were adept at avoiding unnecessary wars, they were fully capable of deploying well-trained forces when their interests required it. Burgundy's army combined feudal levies with professional soldiers, including the fearsome longbowmen from the Low Countries and contingents of armored men-at-arms. The dukes also recognized the importance of artillery, investing in heavy bombards and the latest in siege technology. In their wars, they relied not merely on brute force, but on a calculated use of showmanship, grand parades of troops, carefully staged displays of banners, and the presence of the duke in gleaming armor, to project an image of invincibility that often discouraged rebellion. The territorial expansion under the Valois dukes was remarkable for its mixture of military conquest and inheritance. Through the marriage of Philip the Good to Isabella of Portugal in 1430, Burgundy gained not only a valuable ally in the Iberian Peninsula, but also enhanced prestige and a link to the far-reaching Portuguese trade networks. By the middle of the 15th century, the Burgundian state stretched from the North Sea to the Jura Mountains, encompassing a corridor of wealth and influence that no other single European ruler, save perhaps the King of France, could match. Yet the very diversity that made Burgundy rich also made it difficult to govern. Each territory retained its own laws, privileges, and assemblies, meaning that the duke had to govern through a web of negotiated compromises. The Estates General of the Low Countries, for instance, could be persuaded to grant funds for the duke's projects, but only after prolonged bargaining and assurances that local rights would be respected. This constant negotiation required a level of administrative sophistication uncommon in the period. The Burgundian Chancery developed a professional bureaucracy staffed by trained clerks and lawyers, many of them drawn from the urban elite, whose loyalty was secured through patronage and the promise of advancement. It was in this combination of courtly magnificence, economic dynamism, and bureaucratic innovation that the Burgundian vision truly shone. The dukes were not content to be mere vassals of the French crown. They projected themselves as sovereign princes in their own right, heirs to the legacy of Charlemagne's Middle Kingdom and arbiters of European politics. Even when they paid nominal homage to the King of France or the Holy Roman Emperor, they did so with a grandeur that suggested equality rather than subordination. Their diplomats navigated the complex web of alliances and rivalries in Europe with an eye always toward the long-term goal: the recognition of Burgundy as a kingdom, free from external overlordship. By the time Charles the Bold succeeded his father Philip in 1467, the Burgundian state was at the peak of its power. The cultural prestige of its court was unrivaled, its cities were booming, and its military was formidable. Charles inherited not merely lands, but a vision, one that demanded he transform the duchy and its possessions into a single, unified, and independent kingdom. In pursuing this dream, Charles would take the Burgundian project to its zenith, and ultimately to its collapse. But in the decades before that fall, the rise of the dukes had demonstrated that even within the constraints of medieval feudalism, vision, strategy, and a mastery of both the sword and the marriage bed could create something approaching a modern state centuries ahead of its time. Charles the Bold stepped into his father's place in the year 1467, inheriting a realm that glistened with wealth and prestige, yet was bound together more by the will of its ruler than by any deep institutional unity. His upbringing had been steeped in the chivalric ideals that the Burgundian court so carefully cultivated. From his youth he had been taught that a ruler must not only govern, but embody the virtues of bravery, honor, and glory. To Charles, these ideals were not mere ornaments of kingship, but guiding principles, and in them lay both his greatness and his undoing. The Burgundian state he inherited was at once a marvel and a paradox. It stretched from the Low Countries to the Duchy of Burgundy and the Franche-Comté, a glittering arc of wealth, yet its territories were divided by lands not under his control, especially the troublesome corridor of Lorraine and the bishopric of Liège. To unite his lands into a single continuous block was more than a strategic aim. To Charles it was a personal mission. He saw himself not as a duke among dukes, but as a sovereign who could stand alongside the kings of France and the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire. In his mind, the logical culmination of his dynasty's careful diplomacy was the recognition of Burgundy as a kingdom, an independent crown that would secure its place among the great powers of Europe. Yet Charles's vision, for all its grandeur, often lacked the patient calculation that had marked the rule of his father Philip the Good. Where Philip had excelled at negotiation, Charles tended toward confrontation. He mistrusted compromise, seeing it as a dilution of principle, and preferred to meet challenges head-on. His court, already magnificent under his father, now became the stage for his martial persona. The tournaments grew more elaborate, the pageantry more intense, the rhetoric of honor and valor more insistent. Even his armor was designed to reflect an image of almost mythical heroism, gilded and fluted to catch the light in parades and on the battlefield alike. Early in his reign, Charles pursued alliances that bolstered his ambitions. He maintained cordial relations with England, whose King Edward IV he saw as a potential ally against France, and he negotiated with the Holy Roman Emperor for recognition of his lands as a kingdom. The Emperor, Frederick III, was intrigued but cautious, sensing both the potential and the threat in elevating a ruler who could rival his own authority. The negotiations in Trier in the year 1473 came close to producing a coronation, but they collapsed when Charles's forceful manner and unwillingness to bend alienated the emperor. That failure marked the first great missed opportunity of his reign. While Charles sought royal recognition, he also turned to military campaigns to secure the territorial unity he craved. His attention soon fixed on Lorraine, whose control would bridge the gap between his northern and southern lands. The acquisition of Luxembourg in 1469 through inheritance had already strengthened his position in the region, but Lorraine remained independent under Duke René II. Charles moved against Liège first, crushing repeated uprisings there with a severity that shocked contemporaries. The sack of Liège in 1468, though effective in ending rebellion, damaged his reputation and alienated neighboring powers who feared his ruthlessness. It was in pursuing his designs on Lorraine that Charles encountered the force that would ultimately undo him, the Swiss Confederacy. At first glance, the Swiss seemed an unlikely threat to the most splendid court in Europe. They were a confederation of rural cantons, their power rooted in rugged mountain communities rather than glittering cities. Yet they possessed an exceptional military tradition built on disciplined infantry, pike formations, and a fierce independence born of defending their valleys from outside control. Their victories over Habsburg and Austrian forces earlier in the century had proven that they could defeat the finest mounted knights, and they had grown adept at turning their mountainous terrain into a battlefield advantage. The conflict with the Swiss began as part of a broader struggle. Charles's expansionist aims in Alsace and Lorraine brought him into direct conflict with the interests of the Habsburgs and with local rulers who appealed to the Swiss for aid. What might have been a limited regional war escalated as Charles underestimated the Swiss resolve and overestimated the capacity of his own forces to adapt to their tactics. At Grandson in the year 1476, his army, though larger and more resplendent, suffered a humiliating rout. The Swiss captured vast quantities of Burgundian treasure, including Charles's personal camp, and paraded it as a trophy. The psychological blow was immense. Determined to avenge the defeat, Charles mustered his forces again and met the Swiss at Morat in June of the same year. This time the Burgundian army was annihilated in a devastating pincer attack. Thousands of his men were cut down, the discipline of the Swiss pikemen proving decisive once more. Charles retreated, but refused to abandon his campaign. To him, each defeat was a wound to his honor that could be healed only by ultimate victory. By the end of that year, Charles faced mounting problems. His treasury was strained, his subjects were weary of war, and his enemies sensed weakness. France under King Louis XI, a shrewd and patient adversary, exploited the moment to undermine Burgundian authority. Louis had long sought to dismantle Burgundy's power, and Charles's overreach offered the perfect opportunity. In the winter of 1477, Charles made his final bid to take Nancy, the capital of Lorraine. His army, diminished and demoralized, faced the combined forces of Duke René II and his Swiss allies. On the 5th day of January in that year, in freezing conditions, the Battle of Nancy was fought. Charles's forces were overwhelmed, his lines broken, and he himself was killed in the chaos. His body, stripped and frozen, was found days later, a grim symbol of the sudden collapse of Burgundian power. With Charles's death, the fate of the Burgundian state hung in the balance. He left no legitimate male heir. His only child, Mary of Burgundy, was just 19 years old. The duchy and its associated lands became the target of a ferocious scramble between France, eager to absorb the Burgundian heartland, and the Habsburgs, who saw an opportunity to expand their influence. King Louis XI moved quickly to seize the Duchy of Burgundy itself, citing feudal law that declared it should revert to the French crown in the absence of a male heir. Mary, facing the might of France and lacking the military strength to resist alone, turned desperately to the only option that could preserve at least part of her inheritance, marriage. Her choice was Maximilian of Habsburg, the son of Emperor Frederick III. The match was negotiated with remarkable speed, for delay would mean losing more territory to France. The marriage took place in the summer of 1477, just months after Charles's death. It was, in essence, a political alliance sealed in the most personal of ways. By wedding Maximilian, Mary brought the Burgundian inheritance, especially the wealthy Low Countries, into the orbit of the Habsburg dynasty. This union would change the course of European history. Through it, the Habsburgs gained a foothold in the Low Countries, a base of economic and strategic strength that would fuel their rise over the next century. The marriage set the stage for the vast Habsburg Empire that would later stretch from Spain to Austria to the Americas. For France, it marked a bitter check on Louis's ambitions. While he claimed the Duchy of Burgundy, he could not seize the prosperous northern territories now under Habsburg protection. For Burgundy itself, however, the marriage marked both a salvation and an end. The Burgundian dream of an independent kingdom between France and the Empire was gone, its ambitions folded into the grand strategies of another dynasty. Mary's sudden death in 1482 after a riding accident left her young son Philip the Fair as heir to the Burgundian Habsburg inheritance, ensuring that the lands Charles and his predecessors had gathered would be ruled from Vienna and later from Madrid rather than from Bruges or Dijon. In the span of just over a decade, the state that had dazzled Europe with its wealth, culture, and chivalry had fallen, undone by the fatal flaw of overreaching ambition. Charles the Bold's inability to temper his quest for glory with the patient statecraft of his father had turned potential coronation into catastrophic defeat. Yet in death, through his daughter's marriage, he had unwittingly shaped the dynastic map of Europe for centuries to come. The corridors of power in Brussels and Antwerp would henceforth speak, not of the Valois dukes, but of the Habsburg emperors. And the Burgundian name, once spoken in awe across the courts of Europe, would become a memory, a whisper of what might have been, drowned out by the march of new empires and new ambitions. The marriage of Mary of Burgundy to Maximilian of Habsburg in the year 1477 was more than a personal union. It was the hinge on which the balance of European power swung. In the months after Charles the Bold's death, the political landscape of the continent was in motion like a game board shaken by unseen hands. France, under the calculating eye of Louis XI, moved swiftly to occupy the Duchy of Burgundy itself, claiming feudal rights that none could easily dispute. The Low Countries, the jewel of Mary's inheritance, slipped beyond Louis's grasp into the hands of her new Habsburg husband. What had been the personal dominion of a single duke was now split between two of the most ambitious dynasties in Christendom. The Habsburgs, until then a respectable but geographically fragmented power centered in Austria, suddenly found themselves in possession of some of the richest territories in Europe. Through Mary's lands, Maximilian controlled Flanders, Brabant, Holland, Zeeland, and the Free County of Burgundy, among others. These were not dusty rural provinces, but dynamic centers of trade, finance, and manufacturing. Antwerp, Bruges, and Ghent were names known in every port from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. The revenues from their commerce poured into Habsburg coffers, funding armies, diplomatic missions, and the courtly splendor that would later define the imperial style. It was this sudden influx of wealth and strategic position that transformed the Habsburgs from one power among many into a contender for hegemony. Within a generation, the marriage of Mary and Maximilian would bear further fruit when their son Philip the Fair married Joanna of Castile, linking the Low Countries not only to Austria but to the vast resources of Spain and its burgeoning overseas empire. By the early 16th century, the grandson of Mary, Charles, would inherit a realm that stretched across Europe and the oceans, encompassing Spain, the Low Countries, Austria, parts of Italy, and territories in the New World. The foundation of this immense Habsburg system was laid in the Burgundian inheritance. The geopolitical consequences were immense. Before 1477, France's main rival had been England, its intermittent enemy in the Hundred Years' War. The loss of English lands in France had left Louis XI with an open field for domestic consolidation. But the Habsburg acquisition of the Low Countries presented France with a new, more dangerous encirclement. Not only did the Habsburgs control the Austrian lands to the east, but now they possessed a formidable base directly on France's northern border, within striking distance of Paris. This reality would shape French foreign policy for centuries, fueling the cycles of conflict that defined the early modern period. For France, the immediate gain was significant. By absorbing the Duchy of Burgundy proper, Louis secured a swath of territory that not only expanded the royal domain, but also removed a semi-independent and dangerously ambitious vassal from the political map. Dijon, the former ducal capital, was now firmly under the crown's control, and the once independent Burgundian nobility was brought into the orbit of the Valois monarchy. The psychological impact was equally important. The fall of Burgundy was celebrated as a triumph of royal authority over feudal autonomy, reinforcing the centralizing trend that would eventually produce the absolute monarchy of later centuries. In the longer term, France's territorial expansion in the aftermath of 1477 set precedents for further consolidation. The kingdom began to think of itself as the natural unifier of the lands between the Pyrenees and the Rhine. Yet it also acquired a permanent strategic headache: the necessity of defending its northern frontier against a wealthy, militarily capable Habsburg presence. Time and again in the 16th and 17th centuries, French kings would pour resources into wars aimed at breaking Habsburg power in the Low Countries, from the Italian Wars to the 30 Years' War. Meanwhile, the Low Countries themselves entered a new phase of history. Under the Burgundian dukes, they had enjoyed a measure of autonomy within a loose but glittering federation. The towns and provinces were bound together less by a unified state apparatus than by the charisma, wealth, and ceremonial authority of their ruler. With the transition to Habsburg control, these territories became part of a much larger and more complex political structure. Maximilian and his successors were often physically absent, their attention divided between multiple realms. This distance meant that local institutions, provincial estates, city councils, guilds retained significant power. Yet the Habsburgs also sought to streamline administration and increase their fiscal grip, laying the seeds for future conflict. The Low Countries were valuable, but they were also expensive to defend, especially against France. To fund military campaigns, the Habsburgs pressed for higher taxes and greater centralization. These efforts clashed with the entrenched privileges of the provinces, particularly in Flanders and Brabant, where centuries-old charters guaranteed certain rights. While the Burgundian dukes had been able to negotiate subsidies through pageantry and personal engagement, the distant Habsburg monarchs found themselves facing resistance that would eventually explode into open revolt in the late 16th century. Culturally, the Low Countries under Habsburg rule continued to flourish. The artistic legacy of the Burgundian court did not vanish. Rather, it evolved. The same cities that had produced Jan van Eyck and Rogier van der Weyden now nurtured Peter Bruegel the Elder and later, Peter Paul Rubens. The wealth from trade enabled an unprecedented patronage of the arts and sciences. But alongside this prosperity, the sense of a distinct regional identity began to deepen. The people of these provinces saw themselves as neither fully French nor fully German, but as something unique, a fusion of Latin refinement and northern pragmatism, shaped by rivers, markets, and the sea. This identity would prove both a strength and a fault line. When the Protestant Reformation swept across Europe, the religious and political tensions within the Low Countries erupted. The northern provinces, predominantly Calvinist and fiercely protective of their liberties, broke away in the Dutch Revolt, forming the Dutch Republic. The southern provinces, largely Catholic and loyal to the Habsburgs, became the Spanish Netherlands. Thus, the legacy of the Burgundian lands became one of division as well as prosperity, their geographic unity fractured by the pressures of imperial politics and religious change. In retrospect, the collapse of the Burgundian State and the marriage of Mary to Maximilian created a Europe in which two vast powers, France and the Habsburg Empire, would dominate the political landscape for over a century. The wars between them, fought in Italy, the Low Countries, and beyond, were not merely contests of ambition, but the inevitable consequence of a geopolitical fault line created in 1477. Each side saw the other as an existential threat, and the people of the former Burgundian lands often found themselves caught in the middle of sieges, treaties, and shifting allegiances. For France, the gain of the Duchy of Burgundy was a decisive step toward becoming the most centralized and populous state in Western Europe. For the Habsburgs, the acquisition of the Low Countries was the cornerstone of an empire whose reach would be unprecedented. And for the Low Countries themselves, the end of Burgundian independence marked the beginning of a new, more complicated history, one in which their economic brilliance and cultural achievements would be matched by a recurring struggle to define their place between empires. The map of Europe was redrawn in the wake of Charles the Bold's death, but the lines were not static. They became the boundaries of rival spheres of influence, the frontiers of wars, and the stage for centuries of diplomacy and intrigue. Burgundy as a political entity was gone, but its territories continued to shape the destinies of the powers that inherited them. In that sense, the Burgundian dream lived on, not as an independent kingdom, but as the heart of the contests that defined early modern Europe, a legacy far larger than the dukes who first imagined it. Even though the Burgundian state vanished from the map in the late 15th century, its shadow stretches across the present-day political and cultural landscape of Western Europe in ways most people do not realize. The modern nations of Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and even parts of northern and eastern France still bear the imprint of Burgundian rule in their languages, laws, traditions, and regional self-perceptions. The survival of this legacy is not a matter of nostalgia, but of deeply embedded historical structures, commercial networks, administrative habits, and cultural identities that emerged in the heyday of the Valois dukes and persisted through the centuries of Habsburg, Spanish, Austrian, and French dominion that followed. The Low Countries, in particular, are where the Burgundian influence is most tangible. Before the Burgundian unification of the 14th and 15th centuries, these territories were politically fragmented among countless counties, duchies, and lordships, each with its own feudal obligations and rivalries. The Dukes of Burgundy did not erase these divisions entirely, but they created, for the first time in centuries, a sense of belonging to a broader whole. Through shared institutions such as the Estates General of the Low Countries, the courtly culture centered in Bruges and later Brussels, and a network of laws and charters that were applied with relative consistency, a regional consciousness began to emerge. Even after the Habsburgs took over, the memory of this Burgundian unity informed local resistance to foreign interference, most dramatically in the Dutch Revolt of the 16th century, when the northern provinces broke away to form the Dutch Republic. Belgium's modern identity is in many ways a direct descendant of this Burgundian synthesis. Its coexistence of Dutch-speaking and French-speaking communities reflects the cultural blend that the dukes fostered, where Flemish urban merchants interacted with French-speaking nobles and administrators in the same political space. The elaborate ceremonial traditions in some Belgian cities, from processions to guild displays, often trace their roots to Burgundian times, when public pageantry was used to bind diverse populations together under the Duke's banner. Even the concept of Brussels as a political capital, today the heart of the European Union, owes much to its role under Philip the Good and Charles the Bold as a central meeting place for the estates and the court. The Netherlands, too, carries the Burgundian legacy in subtler ways. The Dutch Golden Age of the 17th century, with its commercial dominance, maritime expansion, and cultural flowering, was built upon urban and mercantile infrastructures first strengthened under Burgundian administration. The emphasis on city autonomy, guild rights, and negotiated taxation had been a hallmark of Burgundian governance, and it shaped the political culture of the Dutch provinces long after they broke away from Habsburg control. In the architecture of Dutch town halls, in the structure of provincial assemblies, and even in the pragmatic spirit of Dutch politics, one can discern a lineage that stretches back to the 15th century dukes who ruled not from a distant imperial capital, but from within the same trading cities they governed. In parts of modern France, particularly Burgundy proper and the Franche-Comté, the memory of the dukes survives in a more localized form. The wine culture of Burgundy, now a global symbol of French gastronomy, flourished under ducal patronage, which encouraged both agricultural refinement and international trade in luxury goods. Dijon, once the capital of a semi-independent state, retains the architectural grandeur of its Burgundian palaces and the urban layout shaped in that period. The Franche-Comté, absorbed into France only in the 17th century after long Habsburg possession, still has a distinct identity that resists full assimilation into the French national narrative, a lingering echo of the days when it was tied more closely to the Low Countries than to Paris. The ghost of the Burgundian Empire also haunts the great power rivalries that defined early modern Europe. Its fall in 1477 created the geopolitical fault line between France and the Habsburgs that would dominate continental politics for nearly 3 centuries. Time and again, wars broke out along the same corridor that had once been the Burgundian heartland. The Franco-Spanish Wars of the 16th century, the 30 Years' War, the War of the Spanish Succession, and even the Napoleonic Wars all had major theaters in the Low Countries and eastern France. The repeated devastation of this region was not simply the result of its wealth, but of its strategic position between 2 competing spheres of influence, a position it had occupied since the days of Philip the Good. Burgundy's fall did not remove it from history. It transformed it into a permanent prize in the contest for European dominance. Control of the former Burgundian lands meant access to rich trade routes, fertile agricultural zones, and urban centers of finance and industry. The Habsburgs used them as a northern bulwark against France and as a financial engine for their wider imperial ambitions. France sought to recover or annex them to secure its borders and to deny its enemies their resources. The people who lived there became accustomed to the shifting flags and treaties, developing a pragmatic adaptability that still characterizes the region's politics today. The untold story of Burgundy's importance lies in how it bridged the worlds of medieval feudalism and early modern statecraft. It was neither a medieval kingdom in the old mold, nor yet a centralized nation-state. Instead, it was a prototype of a multi-ethnic, economically integrated polity governed through a blend of personal loyalty, bureaucratic efficiency, and cultural patronage. The European Union, in its aim to unite diverse nations under common institutions while preserving regional identities, faces challenges remarkably similar to those the Burgundian dukes navigated. Brussels as the capital of the EU is not just a matter of geographic convenience. It is also, in a historical sense, the revival of a Burgundian-era concept of centrality in governance. Why, then, is this empire so forgotten in popular historical consciousness? Partly it is because it lacked the long continuity of France or England. Its life as a unified power spanned little more than a century. Partly it is because its legacy was absorbed into the narratives of its conquerors. French historians emphasize the triumph of Louis XI over feudal rivals. Habsburg chroniclers frame the Burgundian inheritance as a stepping stone to imperial greatness. The Burgundian story is thus scattered, appearing only as a prelude or a footnote in the histories of other states. Yet to overlook Burgundy is to miss a key to understanding modern Europe. The very fault lines that define European history from the Renaissance to the Napoleonic era, the Franco-Habsburg rivalry, the division of the Low Countries, the tension between centralized authority and local privilege, were all shaped in the crucible of Burgundian ambition and collapse. The economic patterns that made the Low Countries a hub of global commerce, the cultural synthesis that made its cities cosmopolitan, and the political traditions that valued negotiation over absolute monarchy were all legacies of Burgundian governance. Even today, the The European Union's struggle to balance unity with diversity mirrors the challenges the Burgundian dukes faced. Just as Philip the Good convened the Estates General to negotiate taxes with representatives from multiple provinces, so too does the EU Parliament bring together voices from across the continent. Just as Charles the Bold sought to forge a kingdom out of territories bound more by trade and shared interest than by common language, so too does the EU attempt to build solidarity across linguistic and cultural divides. The Burgundian experiment, though it ended in military defeat, remains a historical case study in the possibilities and perils of political integration. The Burgundian state was not merely a lost empire, but a formative chapter in Europe's political evolution. Its disappearance reshaped the continent's power map. Its territories became engines of wealth and centers of conflict, and its cultural imprint remains embedded in regional identities. To understand Belgium's linguistic complexity, the Netherlands' commercial resilience, France's historical obsession with securing its northeastern frontier, and the centuries-long centrality of the Low Countries in European diplomacy, one must look back to the Dukes of Burgundy. The echoes of their reign still resonate, not in the form of a surviving kingdom, but in the very fabric of modern Europe, where the unity they once dreamed of and the rivalries they once fueled continue to define the continent's destiny.